Ethan sat on the hard wooden bench, his small hands gripping the leash of Max, their golden retriever. The courtroom was noisy, filled with murmurs and the shuffling of papers, but Ethan didn't seem to notice. His wide brown eyes stayed focused, on the floor, avoiding the curious stares of strangers around him. At just 8 years old, Ethan hadn't spoken a single word in 6 long months, not since his parents' bitter divorce had torn their family apart. It wasn't that he couldn't talk. It was as if the words had been locked away somewhere, deep inside him, unreachable even to those who loved him most. Max, sensing his boy's unease, rested his warm head on Ethan's lap. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion. Max wasn't just any pet. He was a trained service dog, specially chosen to help children like Ethan cope with trauma. For months now, Max had been Ethan's constant companion, staying by his side through sleepless nights and lonely days. He was more than a dog. He was Ethan's lifeline to the world, when everything else felt too overwhelming. Ethan's mother, Sarah, sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting a tissue into knots. She glanced at her son often, her heart breaking a little more each time she saw how withdrawn he'd become. Before the divorce, Ethan had been a bright, chatty child who loved telling jokes and playing outside. But after months of shouting, matches between his parents and the stress of moving homes, something inside him seemed to shut down. No amount of coaxing or pleading could bring back the happy, talkative boy she once knew. On the other side of the room, Ethan's father, Richard, sat stiffly in his chair. Dressed in a sharp suit, he looked every bit the successful businessman he claimed to be. But beneath his confident exterior, Richard felt frustrated and confused. Why wouldn't Ethan speak? And why did Sarah insist on keeping that dog around, all the time? To Richard, Max was nothing more than an unnecessary distraction, a crutch that kept Ethan from facing reality. Today, he was determined to prove to the court that Ethan would be better off living with him, where things were more structured. As the judge entered the room and everyone stood up, Ethan tightened his grip on Max's leash. The dog leaned closer, pressing his solid weight against Ethan's leg. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder, but Ethan didn't look up. Instead, he stared at the polished toes of his sneakers, willing himself to disappear. He hated being here, surrounded by so many people, all watching him, waiting for him to do something, anything. But what could he do? How could he explain that speaking felt like trying to climb a mountain without legs? The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the lawyers began presenting their cases. Words flew back and forth across the room, but Ethan tuned them out. All he cared about was Max. If he could have talked, he might have told someone how much he needed the dog, that Max wasn't just there to make him feel better. Max helped him breathe when the world felt too heavy. Max reminded him that he wasn't alone. But Ethan couldn't say any of that. Not yet. And so, as the arguments continued and the tension in the room grew thicker, Ethan remained silent, clutching Max's leash like it was the only thing holding him together. Unbeknownst to everyone else, however, a moment was coming, a moment that would change everything. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the lawyers took turns presenting their arguments. Ethan's mother, Sarah, sat rigidly beside him, her face pale but determined. Across the room, Richard leaned forward, in his seat, his expression stern and unyielding. The air felt heavy, charged with emotions that neither side seemed willing to let go of. For Ethan, the noise was unbearable, a constant hum of voices overlapping one another, none of which he could fully understand or block out. Sarah's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a devoted mother who had done everything in her power to support her son through an unimaginable upheaval. She described how Sarah had enrolled Ethan in therapy sessions, sought help from specialists, and ensured Max was always there to provide comfort. "My client has sacrificed everything to give her son stability," the lawyer said firmly, gesturing toward Ethan and Max. "Removing him from this environment would only deepen his trauma." Richard's lawyer countered sharply, accusing Sarah of relying too heavily on the dog instead of addressing Ethan's selective mutism directly. "Your Honor," he began, pacing slowly in front of the judge. We're not denying that Ethan is struggling, but we must ask ourselves, is this dog truly helping? Or is it enabling his silence? Mr. Carter believes that a more structured home with clear rules and routines would encourage Ethan to find his voice again. As the two sides argued, Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the floor. His small frame seemed to shrink further into the bench, as if trying to make himself invisible. Max, sensing his boy's distress, shifted slightly, resting his chin on Ethan's lap. Ethan absently stroked the soft fur, drawing strength from the dog's steady presence. Without Max, he didn't know how he'd survive this day, or any other. Finally, the judge turned her attention to Ethan. Her voice softened as she addressed him directly. "Ethan," she said gently, leaning forward so he might look at her, "is there anything you'd like to tell us today? Anything at all?" Everyone in the room fell silent, their eyes now trained on the quiet boy. Ethan froze, his fingers pausing mid-stroke against Max's coat. He wanted to answer, he really did, but no words came. Instead, he shook his head almost imperceptibly, tightening his grip on Max's leash. Richard frowned, clearly displeased. "Your Honor," he interjected, standing up abruptly, "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. This dog shouldn't even be here. It's distracting everyone, including my son." He pointed at Max, his tone sharp. "If Ethan can't speak for himself, then maybe removing the dog will force him to confront his issues head-on." Sarah gasped audibly, clutching the edge of her seat. "That's ridiculous," she protested, her voice trembling with anger. "Max isn't just some distraction, he's part of Ethan's treatment plan. Taking him away would devastate him." The judge raised a hand to silence both parents, her expression thoughtful. She glanced at Ethan, noting the way his knuckles whitened around the leash. Then she looked at Max, whose calm demeanor seemed to radiate reassurance. After a moment, she nodded. "Mr. Carter raises a valid concern," she said evenly. "While I understand the importance of service animals, I must also consider whether they are impeding progress in certain situations. Bailiff, please escort the dog outside temporarily." Panic surged through Ethan like a tidal wave. His breath hitched and his entire body went rigid. No, they couldn't take Max away. Not now, not ever. As the bailiff approached, Ethan instinctively stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. For the first time that day, he lifted his head, his wide eyes locking onto the judge's. Tears welled up, threatening to spill over. But something else happened too. Slowly, hesitantly, Ethan raised one trembling hand and began to move it in deliberate gestures. The room fell utterly still. Even the bailiff stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do next. Ethan wasn't speaking aloud, but his hands were telling a story, one of fear, desperation, and love. He signed 3 simple words, each movement precise despite the tremor in his fingers. "Please, don't take." His final gesture hovered in the air, unfinished, as though he lacked the courage to complete it. Yet the message was clear enough. For a moment, no one reacted. Then the judge blinked, recognition dawning on her face. She had seen those signs before. They were American Sign Language, ASL. Leaning back in her chair, she held up a hand to stop the proceedings. "Hold on," she said softly, her voice carrying across the stunned courtroom. "Let's take a recess. There's something important we need to discuss." As the room erupted into whispers, Ethan sank back onto the bench, tears streaming down his cheeks. Max whined softly, straining toward him, but the bailiff remained frozen, unsure of what to do next. In that brief pause, the world shifted, and nothing would be the same again. The courtroom, once filled with tension and argument, now buzzed with confusion and curiosity. The judge had called for a recess, her voice firm but calm as she instructed everyone to take a short break. Ethan sat frozen on the bench, his chest rising and falling rapidly as tears streamed down his face. Max, still standing nearby with the bailiff holding his leash, let out a soft whine, his big brown eyes locked onto Ethan's trembling form. It was clear that the dog wanted nothing more than to comfort his boy, but for now he remained where he was, caught between orders and instinct. Sarah reached out to place a hand on Ethan's shoulder, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, why her son, who hadn't spoken in months, had suddenly begun moving his hands in deliberate gestures, but she knew it was significant. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "What did you do, sweetheart? Did you sign something?" Ethan didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his small frame shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. His hands rested limply in his lap now, the energy drained from them after his brief attempt at communication. Sarah glanced toward the judge, who was speaking quietly with the court clerk, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she looked at Richard, whose expression was a mix of shock and bewilderment. Clearly, none of them had expected this turn of events. As people filed out of the room during the recess, the atmosphere shifted. Lawyers gathered in hushed conversations near the door, while Richard paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. "What is going on here?" he said aloud, though no one answered him. "Since when does Ethan know sign language? Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Unbeknownst to Richard, or even Sarah, Ethan had been learning ASL in secret over the past few months. During quiet evenings at home, he would sit by his bedroom window with a borrowed book of signs, practicing each gesture until his fingers moved smoothly. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, a distraction from the loneliness that often consumed him. But soon, signing became something more, a lifeline. When words felt impossible, when fear or sadness choked off his ability to speak, Ethan found solace in the silent movements of his hands. It wasn't perfect, and he still struggled with some signs, but it gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in a long time. During the recess, a social worker arrived, along with Ethan's therapist, Ms. Clara Bennett, a kind woman with warm eyes and a soothing voice. Clara had worked closely with Ethan since his parents' separation. She entered the courtroom carrying a notebook and a pen, her presence immediately calming the charged environment. After a quick discussion with the judge, Clara approached Ethan cautiously, kneeling down so she was at eye level with him. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly, offering him a small smile. "Can we talk for a minute?" Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously at Max before nodding almost imperceptibly. Clara pulled up a chair beside him and began asking gentle questions. Slowly, Ethan started responding, not with words but with hesitant gestures. He signed simple phrases like, "I'm scared," and "Max helps me." Each movement was careful, as if he were testing whether it was okay to share this part of himself. Clara nodded encouragingly, jotting notes in her book as she translated his signs aloud for the others in the room. When she explained to the judge and both parents that Ethan had been teaching himself ASL as a coping mechanism, the revelation hit hard. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the realization that her son had found a way to communicate despite everything he'd endured. Richard, on the other hand, looked visibly shaken. For all his talk of structure and discipline, he realized how little he truly understood about his son's inner world. Here was evidence of Ethan's resilience, creativity, and determination, all qualities Richard had failed to see because he hadn't taken the time to look. By the end of the recess, the mood in the courtroom had changed entirely. The arguments about custody and Max's role in Ethan's life felt secondary now. Instead, there was a shared understanding dawning among everyone present. Ethan wasn't just a child caught in the middle of a legal battle. He was a boy trying to navigate a world that often felt too loud, too chaotic, and too painful to bear. And in that moment, the judge made a decision, one that would alter the course of the trial and bring everyone closer to understanding what Ethan really needed. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The sharp edges of tension had softened, replaced by a quiet curiosity that hung in the air like a fragile thread. Everyone seemed to be waiting, watching to see what would happen next. Ethan still sat on the bench, his hands clasped tightly together, his face pale but composed. Max remained at his side now, having been allowed back into the room after the judge reconsidered her earlier decision. The dog's presence alone seemed to steady Ethan, as though his leash was an invisible lifeline connecting him to safety. Ms. Clara Bennett, Ethan's therapist, stood near the front of the room addressing the judge with calm authority. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and measured. "What we've witnessed today is significant. Ethan has been using American Sign Language as a way to express himself when verbal communication feels overwhelming or inaccessible. This isn't just about learning new skills, it's about survival. It's how he copes with trauma and finds a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic to him." The judge nodded thoughtfully, her eyes flickering between Ethan and the note spread out before her. She turned to Sarah and Richard, her expression serious but not unkind. "Both of you have presented strong arguments regarding custody arrangements," she said, "but I believe it's crucial for us to focus on what truly matters here: Ethan's well-being. His ability, or inability, to communicate should not be seen as a failure on either parent's part. Instead, it's an opportunity for all of us to better understand his needs." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence faltering under the weight of this revelation. He glanced at Ethan, who was signing softly to Max, his small hands moving in slow, deliberate motions. For the first time, Richard noticed the subtle nuances in his son's behavior. The way Ethan leaned into the dog's warmth, the way his shoulders relaxed ever so slightly when Max rested his head on Ethan's knee. These were things Richard hadn't paid attention to before, too caught up in his own frustrations and assumptions. Sarah, on the other hand, looked at her son with fresh eyes. She realized that while she'd done everything she could to support him, there were still parts of Ethan's journey she hadn't fully understood. The fact that he'd taught himself ASL without telling anyone spoke volumes about his resilience, but also about the depth of his loneliness. It broke her heart to think of him sitting alone in his room, practicing signs because he didn't know how else to reach out. Clara continued, her tone gentle but firm. "Ethan's use of ASL doesn't mean he'll never speak again. In fact, it's quite the opposite. By giving him alternative ways to express himself, we're laying the groundwork for future progress. But it's important to remember that healing takes time. Pushing Ethan too hard or removing the tools he relies on, like Max, could set him back significantly." The judge listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When Clara finished speaking, she addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady, "you mentioned earlier that you believe structure and discipline are key to helping Ethan find his voice. While those principles are valuable, they must be balanced with compassion and understanding. Children like Ethan need more than rules. They need connection. They need to feel safe enough to take risks, even if those risks involve vulnerability." Richard swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, unsure of what to say. For years, he'd prided himself on being a man of logic and order, someone who approached problems with practical solutions. But now, faced with the reality of his son's silent struggle, he felt utterly unprepared. How could he fix something he barely understood? As the session progressed, the judge invited Clara to demonstrate Ethan's bond with Max. With the court's permission, Clara asked Ethan to show everyone how the dog helped him navigate daily challenges. At first, Ethan hesitated, his body stiffening with nerves. But when Max nudged his hand gently, encouraging him, Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. One by one, he performed simple tasks with Max's assistance, fetching a dropped item, signaling for comfort when feeling anxious, and even guiding the dog to alert others if he needed help. Each interaction highlighted the profound trust and partnership between boy and dog, leaving many in the courtroom visibly moved. By the end of the demonstration, the room was silent except for the occasional sniffle from Sarah. Even Richard seemed affected, his earlier skepticism replaced by a dawning realization. As he watched Ethan interact with Max, he saw glimpsely of the son he used to know, the bright, curious boy who loved animals and laughed easily. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of that child. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find him again. The courtroom, once filled with heated arguments and rigid postures, had transformed into a space of quiet observation. All eyes were on Ethan as he stood beside Max, his small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the moment, but steadied by the dog's unwavering presence. Clara guided him gently through each demonstration, her voice soft and encouraging. "Show everyone how Max helps you when something falls," she said, dropping a pen deliberately onto the floor. Ethan hesitated for just a second before signaling to Max with a simple hand gesture. The golden retriever sprang into action, retrieving the pen and placing it carefully back in Ethan's hand. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the room, though it quickly faded as everyone remained captivated by the boy and his dog. Next, Clara asked Ethan to demonstrate how Max comforted him during moments of distress. This time, Ethan didn't need prompting. He placed both hands over his ears, a gesture that had become familiar to Sarah whenever loud noises or tense situations overwhelmed him, and took a shaky breath. Almost instantly, Max moved closer, pressing his warm body against Ethan's legs and resting his head on the boy's lap. Ethan's trembling hands found their way to Max's fur, stroking it rhythmically as his breathing slowed. It was a subtle exchange, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but profoundly intimate to those who understood the depth of their bond. The final demonstration brought tears to more than one person's eyes. Clara explained that Max was trained to alert others if Ethan needed help, whether it was due to anxiety, fear, or physical discomfort. To illustrate this, she whispered instructions to Ethan, who then tapped lightly on Max's side twice. Without hesitation, the dog trotted over to Clara, nudging her hand insistently until she acknowledged him. She turned to the judge and said, "Max knows exactly what to do when Ethan can't ask for help himself. He bridges the gap between silence and support." As the demonstrations concluded, the energy in the room shifted again. What had started as a contentious custody battle now felt like a collective reckoning, a moment where everyone present was forced to confront the humanity at the heart of the case. Even Richard, who had entered the courtroom brimming with frustration and determination, seemed to soften. His arms, once crossed tightly over his chest, now hung loosely at his sides. He watched Ethan interact with Max, noting the way the dog responded to even the smallest cues from the boy. There was no doubt about it. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a lifeline. Sarah wiped away a tear, her heart swelling with pride and relief. For months she'd fought tirelessly to prove that Max was essential to Ethan's well-being, fearing that someone might dismiss him as unnecessary. But now, seeing the reactions of the judge, the lawyers, and even Richard, she felt vindicated. No one could deny the profound connection between Ethan and Max, or the role it played in helping her son navigate a world that often felt too heavy to bear. The judge leaned forward, her expression thoughtful as she addressed the room. "What we've seen here today is remarkable," she began, her voice carrying a tone of admiration. "It's clear that Max isn't merely a companion. He's a vital part of Ethan's healing process. Removing him would not only disrupt the progress Ethan has made, but could also cause significant harm." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns about structure and routine, but sometimes the most effective solutions aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones our children create for themselves." Richard nodded slowly, his face etched with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he still believed that living with him might provide Ethan with stability. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the evidence before him. Max wasn't a distraction or a crutch, he was a bridge. And without that bridge, Richard realized, Ethan might retreat even further into himself. When the session adjourned temporarily, Richard approached Sarah cautiously. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed, stepping aside with him near the back of the courtroom. For the first time in months, they spoke without anger or accusation. Richard admitted that he hadn't fully grasped the extent of Ethan's struggles, or the importance of Max in his life. Sarah, in turn, acknowledged that Richard cared deeply for their son, even if he sometimes struggled to show it in ways Ethan understood. By the time they returned to their seats, a fragile truce had formed, not a resolution, but a starting point. As the judge prepared to deliver her verdict, Ethan sat quietly beside Max, his fingers absently tracing patterns in the dog's fur. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while he felt seen. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a child who deserved love, patience, and understanding. The judge's voice broke the silence as she prepared to deliver her decision, her tone measured but firm. After careful consideration of the evidence presented today, she began looking around the courtroom at each person involved. It is clear that Ethan's well-being must remain the central focus of this case. Both parents have expressed genuine concern for their son's future, but it is equally evident that certain conditions are necessary for his continued growth and healing. She turned her attention to Richard first, her gaze steady. "Mr. Carter, your desire to provide structure and stability for Ethan is commendable. However, I urge you to recognize that structure alone cannot replace the emotional support and connection he needs. Ethan has shown us today that he communicates in ways beyond words, through gestures, trust, and relationships like the one he shares with Max. Disrupting these connections would not serve his best interests." Richard nodded slowly, his face lined with a mixture of regret and resolve. He glanced at Ethan, who sat quietly beside Max, his small hands resting on the dog's back. For the first time, Richard saw his son not as a distant figure whose behavior baffled him, but as a child navigating pain in the only way he knew how. The judge's words resonated deeply within him, forcing him to confront the gaps in his understanding. He realized now that demanding Ethan snap out of his silence or adapt to rigid routines wasn't fair, not when the boy was already carrying so much. Turning to Sarah, the judge continued, "Mrs. Thompson, you've demonstrated unwavering dedication to supporting Ethan through therapy, counseling, and the inclusion of Max in his daily life. This court acknowledges the positive impact these efforts have had on his ability to cope. However, maintaining consistency will require ongoing commitment from both you and Mr. Carter moving forward." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding as tears welled up in her eyes. She felt a mix of relief and gratitude for the judge's recognition of her efforts, but also for the opportunity to keep Ethan in an environment where he felt safe. Still, she understood the importance of fostering a relationship between Ethan and his father, even if it meant stepping outside her comfort zone to make it happen. With that, the judge announced her ruling. Primary physical custody would remain with Sarah, given her established role in Ethan's care and the stability of their home environment. However, Richard would be granted joint custody, including regular visitation rights designed to rebuild trust and strengthen his bond with Ethan. Additionally, the judge mandated family counseling sessions for all three of them, a step intended to help bridge the gap between father and son. As the verdict sank in, Richard stood motionless, absorbing its weight. He felt a pang of guilt knowing how much he'd underestimated Ethan's needs, and how often he'd dismissed Max as irrelevant. But there was also a flicker of hope. The judge hadn't shut him out entirely. Instead, she'd given him a chance to repair what had been broken. As he looked at Ethan again, Richard resolved to do better, to listen more, judge less, and meet his son where he was, rather than expecting him to conform to unrealistic expectations. Later that evening, after the courtroom had emptied and the day's tension began to fade, Richard arrived at Sarah's house unannounced. It was a bold move, one that surprised even himself. But he felt compelled to take action while the lessons of the day were still fresh in his mind. When Sarah opened the door cautiously, he held up a small gift, a puzzle box adorned with colorful patterns. "I thought maybe we could start over," he said awkwardly, glancing toward Ethan, who lingered near the doorway with Max by his side. Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around Max's leash. But when Richard knelt down to his level, holding out the puzzle without saying another word, something shifted. Slowly, tentatively, Ethan stepped forward and accepted it. The gesture was small, a mere exchange of objects, but it carried the weight of possibility. For the first time in months, Richard smiled genuinely, seeing not just the silent boy before him, but the resilient, brave child who deserved every effort to heal. That night, as Ethan played quietly with the puzzle pieces, on the living room floor, Max lying faithfully nearby, Sarah watched from the doorway. She noticed the faintest hint of a smile tugging at Ethan's lips, a rare sight lately. Though challenges lay ahead, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a path toward understanding, forgiveness, and love. Months passed after the court's decision, and life began to settle into a fragile but hopeful rhythm for Ethan, Sarah, and Richard. The judge's ruling had been clear. Stability was key, and both parents needed to play active roles in Ethan's healing journey. For Sarah, this meant continuing to provide the nurturing environment Ethan thrived in, with Max always by his side. For Richard, it meant embracing a new way of connecting with his son, one rooted in patience, understanding, and a willingness to learn. At first, Richard struggled. Visitation days were awkward, filled with long stretches of silence as Ethan focused on puzzles or books, rarely looking up. Max often accompanied Ethan during these visits, serving as a bridge between father and son. Richard initially felt frustrated by the dog's constant presence, but over time, he began to see how much comfort Max brought to Ethan. Instead of dismissing the bond, Richard decided to lean into it. He started bringing treats for Max, earning small smiles from Ethan when the dog wagged his tail enthusiastically. These moments, though fleeting, gave Richard a sense of progress. Family counseling sessions became a cornerstone of their shared effort. At first, they were difficult. Ethan sat stiffly beside Max, avoiding eye contact, while Sarah and Richard exchanged tense glances across the room. But their therapist, Ms. Clara Bennett, was patient and skilled at creating safe spaces for connection. She encouraged Richard to share stories about his own childhood, prompting him to talk about the pets he'd loved growing up, or the games he used to play. To everyone's surprise, Ethan listened intently, occasionally signing questions that Clara translated aloud. One breakthrough came during a session when Clara suggested they try something different. "Let's focus on what Ethan enjoys," she said gently. "If we can find common ground, it might help build trust." That week, Richard arrived at Sarah's house with a kite he'd bought on impulse. It was colorful and whimsical, designed to catch the wind easily. When Ethan saw it, his eyes lit up for the first time in months. Together, the three of them and Max headed to the park, where Richard patiently helped Ethan assemble the kite and let it soar into the sky. Watching Ethan laugh as the kite danced against the clouds was a turning point. Richard realized that joy didn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it could be found in simple moments of togetherness. From then on, he made an effort to engage in activities Ethan enjoyed. Flying kites, playing fetch with Max, or working on puzzles together. Each interaction, no matter how small, chipped away at the walls that had grown between them. Sarah noticed changes too. Ethan still hadn't spoken aloud, but there were signs of progress. He began signing more frequently, even attempting new words and phrases outside of therapy. One evening, as Sarah tucked him into bed, Ethan signed, "I love you, Mom." Tears streamed down her face as she hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by the weight of those unspoken words. It was proof that her boy was finding ways to express himself, and that their bond remained unshakable. For Richard, the most profound moment came during one of his weekend visits. They were sitting on the porch, watching Max chase leaves in the yard, when Ethan suddenly turned to him and signed, "Thank you for coming." Richard froze, stunned by the gesture. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't respond. Then, blinking back tears, he signed back clumsily, "You're welcome." It wasn't perfect. His movements were awkward and unsure, but Ethan smiled softly, acknowledging the effort. These incremental steps toward healing weren't easy, and there were still setbacks along the way. Some days Ethan retreated into himself, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't articulate. Other days, Richard grew impatient, wondering if they'd ever fully reconnect. But through it all, they kept trying, because beneath the struggles lay a foundation of love that refused to crumble. As winter approached, Ethan began attending weekly American Sign Language classes with Sarah. He blossomed in the supportive environment, gaining confidence as he mastered new signs and connected with others who communicated the same way. Max, ever faithful, accompanied them to every class, serving not just as a service dog but as a symbol of resilience and hope. Though challenges remained, the cracks in their fractured family were slowly mending. Ethan may not have spoken aloud, but his actions and Max's unwavering loyalty spoke volumes about the power of love, patience, and second chances. And for the first time in a long while, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing seasons came a quiet transformation in Ethan's life. The once heavy silence that surrounded him began to soften, replaced by small but meaningful moments of connection. Sarah noticed it first, how Ethan's hands moved more confidently when signing, how his laughter rang out more often during playtime with Max. Even Richard, who had once struggled to understand his son's world, found himself smiling as Ethan taught him new signs each week. One sunny Saturday morning, Richard arrived at Sarah's house with a surprise, a beginner's ASL book tucked under his arm. "I thought maybe we could practice together," he said awkwardly, holding it out to Ethan. For a moment, Ethan just stared at the book, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he signed, "Okay." They sat together on the porch, flipping through the pages as Richard stumbled over the signs, his fingers clumsy but determined. When he finally managed to sign "good job" correctly after several attempts, Ethan grinned, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and clapped, his hands softly. That afternoon, as they walked to the park with Max trotting happily beside them, something extraordinary happened. Ethan stopped suddenly near the swings and turned to Richard. His hands moved hesitantly at first, forming shaky but deliberate signs. "You are nice now." Richard froze, his heart swelling with emotion. He knelt down to Ethan's level, meeting his gaze for the first time without barriers between them. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Though Ethan didn't respond verbally, the warmth in his eyes said everything words couldn't. Back home, Sarah marveled at the progress. She knew better than to expect miracles overnight. Ethan's journey was still ongoing, and there would likely be ups and downs ahead. But she also saw glimpses of the boy he used to be, curious, playful, full of quiet wonder. One evening, while baking cookies together, Ethan surprised her by signing, "Can I help?" She handed him the mixing bowl, watching as he carefully stirred the batter, his focus unwavering. When the cookies came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, Ethan signed, "We did good." It was one of the simplest sentences he'd ever formed, but to Sarah it felt monumental. Max remained the constant thread weaving through their lives, his presence a reminder of how far they'd come. On weekends, Richard took Ethan and Max to the dog park, where they spent hours throwing balls and laughing as Max sprinted after them. These outings became cherished rituals, bonding father and son in ways neither had imagined possible. Slowly but surely, Richard learned to see Max not as an obstacle but as a partner in Ethan's healing, a bridge that brought them closer together. By summer, Ethan began attending a special program for children who communicated using ASL. Surrounded by peers who understood his language, he flourished. At the end of the first session, he proudly showed Sarah and Richard a drawing he'd made of himself, Max, and both his parents standing hand in hand beneath a bright yellow sun. Beneath the picture, he'd written, in shaky block letters, the word family. It wasn't until late August, during one of their routine visits, that Ethan spoke aloud for the first time. They were sitting in the backyard watching fireflies blink against the twilight sky, when Richard asked, "What do you like most about summer?" Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowing as though searching for courage. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Fireflies." The word hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. Richard blinked, stunned, before pulling Ethan into a tight hug. "That's my boy," he murmured, his voice trembling. From that day forward, Ethan's speech returned gradually, bit by bit. Words spilled out hesitantly at first, then grew stronger with practice. Yet even as his voice emerged, he never abandoned. Signing, it remained a part of who he was, a testament to the resilience he'd shown during his darkest days. And through it all, Max stayed by his side, wagging his tail and offering unconditional love. In the end, Ethan's story wasn't just about finding his voice. It was about discovering the strength within himself and learning that he wasn't alone. With Sarah's unwavering support, Richard's growing understanding, and Max's steadfast companionship, Ethan found his way back to the light. Together, they proved that love, patience, and compassion could mend even the deepest wounds.